I want you to imagine the heavy silence of an ancient tent, the dry desert air seeping through the openings in the time-worn fabric, and an old man, his eyes almost completely blinded, groping in the emptiness before him as he calls for the son he believes to be the natural heir to everything he has built throughout his life. Because even before Jacob was born, even before any wrong choice, before any deception, his story begins surrounded by a real, visceral, dangerous conflict still within his mother's womb. When Rebecca feels her son struggling within her so intensely that the joy of pregnancy mixes with fear, confusion, and the feeling that something is profoundly out of place, as if those two lives were already locked in a battle that was not only physical but spiritual, a conflict that would span generations and shape entire destinies. And at that moment, when she seeks the Lord in anguish, God reveals something that breaks all human logic by saying that the older would serve the younger, a word that brings not immediate comfort, but rather tension, because when God announces his plans, he rarely eliminates the conflict. He merely reveals that it will be present within it. When Jacob is born, grasping his brother's heel, it's not just a curious detail of the birth, it's a silent symbol of someone who arrives in the world already trying not to be left behind, someone who feels from his first breath that he will need to fight to exist, to be seen, to receive what always seems to be in the hands of another. And while Esau grows up as the strong, impulsive son, admired by his father, Jacob grows up in the shadows of the tent, observing, calculating, learning to survive not by the strength of his muscles, but by intelligence, by waiting, by strategy. And here I need you to perceive something very human, because Jacob is not born a villain, he is born insecure, and often insecurity is the soil where wrong choices begin to take deep root, especially when love within the family is not distributed fairly, when a father prefers one son and a mother prefers another, creating invisible cracks that over time turn into abysses. I can still smell the hot stew from that day when Esau returns hungry from the field, exhausted, overcome by his body, while Jacob is there at home, with the pot slowly simmering, because there are moments when life places before us opportunities that seem small, almost banal, but that carry eternal consequences. And Esau, driven by impulse, despises what he cannot touch or eat at that moment, while Jacob, driven by the fear of loss, by the desire to secure his place, accepts to exchange food for inheritance. And perhaps you have done something similar, perhaps not with a brother, but with God, when you traded something eternal for immediate relief, or when you tried to secure blessings using control instead of trust. Because the biblical text does not romanticize Jacob, it only shows us that God chose to work with someone real, full of flaws, someone who did not yet know how to fully trust, someone who believed he needed to manipulate the future so as not to be forgotten. What begins as a seemingly simple exchange transforms into a chain of decisions that pushes Jacob into an even more dangerous place. Years later, when Isaac is blind and decides to release the final blessing, that word laden with destiny, Jacob finds himself facing a choice that carries real risk, not only emotional but physical. Deceiving a father in that context meant not only breaking a moral code, but also tampering with deep spiritual structures. And yet, moved by Rebekah's encouragement, Jacob enters the tent, feels the weight of the lie leaving his mouth, feels his heart race when his father touches his hands covered in goatskin. And when the blessing is released, it can no longer be taken back. At that moment, even receiving what he always desired, Jacob begins to realize that blessings gained without inner peace carry too high a price. Esau's cry upon discovering the loss is not merely a lament, it is the sound of consequence echoing through the house, the pain born when someone realizes too late the value of what they despised. At the same time, it is the beginning of Jacob's deepest fear, Because now he is not just the chosen son, he is a marked man, threatened, pursued by his own blood. And when Rebekah tells him to flee, when he leaves the house in haste, taking almost nothing but his own body and a promise he doesn't yet fully understand, Jacob doesn't leave as a hero. He leaves as a fugitive, carrying guilt, fear, loneliness, and a question he doesn't yet know how to formulate, but which already weighs heavily within him. Does God truly remain with someone who had to deceive in order to survive? And it is precisely at this point that the story begins to touch the most. Hidden parts of the human heart, because before Jacob becomes Israel, before wrestling with the angel, before being transformed, he needs to cross the night of flight, the silence of the desert, the weight of his own choices, and perhaps you are also in that place now, not physically running, but fleeing from something you yourself built, trying to understand if there is still grace after wrong decisions, if there is still a future when the past seems to scream louder, and this tension, this silent fear, is the ground where God begins to reveal himself unexpectedly, not as a distant judge, but as someone who enters the story exactly when everything seems out of control. Jacob walks alone for the first time, and I want you to feel the weight of that solitude, because until then, he had always lived surrounded by voices, other people's decisions, family protections. But now each step echoes in the darkness of the path that leads away from home, away from his father's tent, away from the face of his mother who encouraged him and at the same time cast him into this silent exile. And as the sun sets and the desert night closes in on him, Jacob is not only fleeing from Esau, he is fleeing from his own past, trying to distance himself from the sound of his brother's cry, from his father's trembling as he realizes the lie, from the blessing that now weighs as something too heavy to be carried by someone who still doesn't know who he really is. And when he finally stops, exhausted, without the strength to go on, without a clear plan for the next day, he lies down on the hard ground, puts a stone under his head and tries to sleep, not as one who rests, but as one who surrenders for lack of alternatives. It is on this cold ground, far from any altar built by human hands, that God chooses to draw near, and this already reveals something that heals silently. Because Jacob was not praying with beautiful words, he was not offering sacrifices, he was not trying to negotiate anything, he was simply sleeping, broken, vulnerable, without realizing that heaven was about to open above him. And when the vision appears, a ladder connecting earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending, what is being revealed is not just a spiritual spectacle, but a profound truth. Even when man is fleeing, God's movement continues. Even when Jacob is fallen on the ground, heaven is not closed. And perhaps you also need to hear this, because there are times when guilt convinces us that we have lost access, that we have crossed an invisible boundary, when in fact God continues to move silently above that which we cannot yet understand. The voice Jacob hears that night doesn't come with accusation, doesn't enumerate errors, doesn't demand explanations. It simply presents itself as continuity, as faithfulness, as a promise that spans generations. And when God says he will be with him, that he will protect him on the way, that he will bring him back, he is not approving of deception, but is affirming something deeper, that the story didn't end in error, that the promise didn't depend on perfection. This directly confronts the logic of fear that dwells in the human heart, because Jacob probably expected silence, perhaps judgment, perhaps abandonment, and instead receives presence. And this presence doesn't immediately remove his problems, doesn't cancel the exile, doesn't resolve the conflict with Esau, but plants something new within him. A seed of trust that is still fragile but real. When Jacob awakens, the fear he feels is not terror, it is reverence. It is the realization that God was there all along and he didn't notice, and this is one of the most honest moments of biblical spirituality, because it doesn't arise from ecstasy, it arises from belated awareness. It arises from the humble recognition that God acts before being recognized, and by raising the stone as a memorial, by pouring oil on it, Jacob is not founding a religion, he is marking a meeting point, a place where the fugitive realized he was not abandoned, and when he makes a vow, still full of conditions, still trying to organize his faith in terms he can control, we see that the transformation is not instantaneous. It begins imperfect, negotiated, insecure, but alive. This moment on the journey doesn't transform Jacob into a saint, nor does it resolve his tendency toward control, but it changes something essential, because from that point on, he carries not only the stolen blessing, but a personal experience with God. And that makes all the difference. There's a huge distance between knowing stories about God and knowing that he spoke to you in the middle of the night when no one else was watching. And perhaps that's exactly the kind of encounter that many people still lack. Not something public, not something spectacular, but something intimate, silent, that doesn't eliminate problems, but changes the way they are carried. Jacob rises that morning still a fugitive, still someone who will face difficult years, deceptions, losses, and disappointments. But now he walks knowing he is not alone, even without fully understanding what that means. And this awareness, still fragile, still under construction, is the first real step in transformation, because God doesn't begin by changing Jacob's name that night. He begins by changing his perception, planting a simple and profound truth. Heaven did not close when you erred. And as Jacob continues towards Haran, carrying this experience in his heart, something within him begins to move slowly, preparing the ground for much greater confrontations yet to come, confrontations that will not only happen with men, but with God himself. Jacob arrives in Haran carrying more than dust on his feet and weariness on his shoulders, because he carries with him a promise he doesn't yet know how to live and an identity that hasn't yet been healed. As he approaches the well, that place of decisive encounters where stories begin and destinies intertwine, the environment seems ordinary. Shepherds gathered, flocks waiting, a large stone blocking the water's mouth. But behind this normality, something is stirring. Jacob doesn't know it, but life is about to place him before an experience that will confront him with what he has always done to others, now being done to him. And when he sees Rachel approaching with her father's flocks, something within him ignites, not just desire, but the feeling of finally finding a place, a face, a possibility of belonging. And as he rolls the heavy stone from the well alone, in a gesture that mixes physical strength and emotional urgency, Jacob seems to say without words that he is willing to strive, to prove his worth, to build something different from the past he left behind. The encounter with Laban begins amidst embraces, familiar words, implicit promises of welcome, and for a time Jacob feels safe, useful, needed, working with dedication, giving years of his life for love of Rachel, and these years pass like days in his heart, because when affection is true, effort seems light. But it is precisely here that the story begins to become uncomfortably familiar, because the same man who entered his father's tent in disguise now enters a wedding night believing he has finally received what he worked for. And at dawn, when he realizes he has been deceived, Jacob experiences something he had never fully felt before: the impact of being the other side of the lie, the silent pain of realizing that the cunning he used as a tool has now become an open wound in his own history. The question Jacob asks Laban, full of indignation and disbelief, echoes like a mirror of the past, because upon hearing the cold explanation about local customs and family priorities, something begins to break within him. not just trust, but the illusion that controlling situations guarantees security. And by agreeing to work another 7 years, by submitting to an agreement he cannot alter, Jacob enters a period of life that many know well. That time when we realize that certain pains cannot be avoided, only traversed, and that some harvests come not as direct punishment, but as an opportunity to see oneself more honestly. The home that forms from this deception is not peaceful. It is marked by rivalry, comparison, tense silence, and hidden tears, because when love is unequal, it does not generate rest, but rather conflict. Jacob, who grew up in a house divided by favoritism, now lives within a family that repeats the same pattern, loving one wife more than the other, without realizing that he is perpetuating an old pain. And as the children begin to be born, each name carries the cry of a wounded heart, especially Leah's, who seeks to be seen, loved, and recognized. Perhaps you will see here how the Bible does not embellish families. It exposes them, because God does not work only in ideal environments. He enters broken stories and begins to act from there. Years pass, and Jacob prospers, but this prosperity does not come without hardship, sleepless nights, days in intense heat, unfair negotiations, changed wages, frustrated expectations, and little by little, the man who fled with nothing begins to become someone tired of fighting alone, someone who begins to realize that living always on alert, always trying to anticipate losses, exacts too high a price. And when God finally calls him to return to the land of his fathers, Jacob understands that he is not only returning geographically, he is being invited to face everything he left behind, unresolved, especially the face of Esau, the memory of the deception, the wound that remained open for years. The departure from Haran happens in silence, almost like a repetition of the previous escape, but this time Jacob takes with him wives, children, flocks, and responsibilities, and yet fear accompanies him, because outward growth does not mean inner healing. And upon learning that Esau is coming to meet him with 400 men, Jacob feels the ground move again beneath his feet, dividing camps, preparing gifts, calculating possibilities, doing everything he always knew how to do, to try to control the outcome. But now there is something different, because in the midst of this strategy, there is a prayer that sounds more humble, more broken, less self-confident, and more aware that without God's intervention, no plan will be sufficient. That night, on the banks of the Jabbok River, when Jacob sends everything he has to the other side and remains alone, the silence is not empty. It is heavy, laden with everything that has been kept for years, and it is there, exactly there, at the point where there is nothing left to hold on to, that someone approaches, not as a clear ally, nor as an identified enemy, but as a challenging presence. And when the combat begins, Jacob fights as he always fought, with resistance, with insistence, with a refusal to let go, without realizing that this fight is not to win, it is to transform, because some battles do not exist to show strength, they exist to reveal limits. And as the dawn advances, something inside Jacob is about to change, irreversibly. The struggle continues through the night without Jacob being able to identify exactly who is before him, because there are encounters that God does not allow to be clearly defined at the beginning, precisely so that they cannot be controlled. And while bodies clash in the darkness, raising dust, stumbling over stones, breathing with difficulty, Jacob is not only using physical strength, he's releasing decades of accumulated tension, guarded fear, strategies built to avoid defeat. And perhaps for the first time in his life, he fights without a clear exit plan, without a prepared deception, without a visible escape route, simply remaining, resisting, refusing to let go, like someone who has finally understood that fleeing has always led him to the same inner place, and that now, even without understanding, he needs to stay. When the touch reaches his thigh and the dislocation occurs, the pain is immediate, deep, debilitating, and at that instant, Jacob understands something that no words could teach, because the struggle changes in nature. He can no longer win. He can no longer support himself in the same way. He can no longer trust his own body, and yet he clings on even tighter. Not out of pride, but out of necessity, because there is a moment in spiritual life when we realize that we can no longer emerge unscathed, that something needs to be touched, broken, exposed, so that the transformation is real. And when Jacob says that he will not let go without receiving a blessing, he is not asking for prosperity. He is asking for meaning, identity, confirmation that this pain is not useless. The question that follows cuts through history like a silent blade, because when that presence asks for Jacob's name, it is not seeking information. It is summoning confession. It is bringing to the surface everything that name carries: the deceiver, the supplanter, the one who always tried to secure his own place by taking the place of another. And in answering Jacob, he does not present titles, does not list achievements, does not mention promises. He presents himself naked, reduced to what he always was. And it is precisely there that the change happens. Not before, not during the struggle, but in the honest recognition of who one is before God. The new name doesn't come as a reward for performance. It comes as a declaration of identity. Because by calling him Israel, the one who wrestles with God and with men and endures, God doesn't erase Jacob's past. He gives it new meaning, transforming the story of escape into a story of permanence, of someone who didn't win because he was stronger, but because he didn't give up on remaining even when wounded. And the sunrise finds Jacob limping, blessed and marked, carrying on his body the sign that real encounters with God never leave everything intact, but also never leave everything as it was. When he crosses the path and finally sees Esau approaching, now in the light of day, the fear still exists, but he no longer rules in the same way, because something has been rearranged during the night, and by bowing repeatedly before his brother, Jacob is not merely following protocol, he is offering something he had never offered before: real vulnerability. And when the embrace happens, unexpected, strong, accompanied by tears, the reconciliation does not erase the past, but ends the cycle of persecution that has accompanied him throughout his life, showing that not all wounds are healed with rigid justice. Some are healed with unexpected mercy. Life after that is not without pain, because the Bible does not promise simple endings. It promises continuous presence, and Jacob will still face profound losses, family conflicts, his son's mistakes, grief that silently affects him. But now he walks as someone who knows he no longer needs to steal blessings because he has already received one. And as the years advance, as his hair turns grey, as he holds his grandchildren in his arms and crosses his hands to bless the youngest, repeating a gesture that spans generations, it becomes clear that the transformation was not an isolated event. It was a long, painful, and faithful process sustained by a God who never let go of Jacob, even when Jacob tried to let go of everything else. And when his story ends, not with an absence of suffering, but with a fullness of meaning, Jacob leaves behind something greater than flocks or lands. He leaves the testimony that God works with real people, marked, imperfect people, people who struggle, who err, who flee, but who one day learn to persevere. And perhaps that is exactly what this story whispers to those who listen attentively, that your struggle, if lived before God, may not leave you unscathed, but it may ultimately leave you whole. After reconciling with Esau, Jacob's life enters a phase that, at first glance, seems more stable, but inside it remains full of unresolved layers, because there are pains that no longer scream, but still influence decisions. And when he settles in the land, builds altars and gives names that acknowledge God as present in his story, we realize that something has changed profoundly, not in the absence of conflicts, but in the way he deals with them. Now less impulsive, more conscious, still imperfect, but different from that man who fled trying to save his own skin. Because maturing spiritually does not mean ceasing to suffer. It means learning not to allow suffering alone to dictate the course of life. The violence involving his daughter Dinah and the brutal response of Simeon and Levi shatter this period of relative peace, once again exposing how untreated family wounds can generate disproportionate reactions. Jacob, now called Israel, feels the weight of leading a household marked by impulses similar to those of Esau in the past. And perhaps this confronts him with something painful, the realization that even after profound encounters with God, we still need to watch over what grows within ourselves and within those we love, because blessing does not replace responsibility, and promise does not eliminate the need for daily discernment. When God calls him back to Bethel, the place of their first encounter, there is something profoundly restorative about this return, because God is not leading him to a new place, but to an old place with a different man. By ordering his house to be purified, to abandon foreign gods, to change his clothes, Jacob is outwardly doing what he had already begun inwardly years before, cleansing symbols, breaking invisible bonds, recognizing that it is not possible to walk with God carrying everything at once. And in this gesture, there is healing, not only spiritual but emotional, because choosing what stays and what is left behind is an essential part of the maturity of faith. Rachel's death affects Jacob silently and profoundly, because some losses don't generate words, only a constant emptiness. By naming his son Benjamin, replacing the painful name his mother gave him, Jacob reveals something new within himself, the ability to not allow suffering to have the last word. This is significant because the man who was once defined by fear now begins to name the future with hope, even when his heart is broken, showing that the transformation has not made him insensitive, but more aware of the fragility of life. Years pass, and Jacob, now Israel, carries in his heart a special love for Joseph, Rachel's son. Here, the story bends back on itself again because favoritism returns, almost like an echo of something ancient that insists on reappearing. When the brothers sell Joseph, repeating the cycle of deceit, lies, and symbolic bloodshed, Jacob experiences a paralyzing pain, a pain that seems like punishment, but actually becomes a silent instrument of preparation. Because while he weeps, believing he has lost his beloved son, God is weaving something much greater, far from his eyes, teaching him that not even the wrong choices of children can nullify divine faithfulness. The long years of mourning shape Jacob differently from previous struggles, because now he cannot negotiate, flee, or fight. He can only wait. And perhaps this is one of the most difficult forms of transformation, the kind that happens when there is no possible action, only permanence. And when the news finally arrives that Joseph is alive, not only alive, but ruling Egypt, Jacob's heart needs to learn to receive joy again, almost like someone who unlearns how to smile after a long time. And as he goes down to Egypt, guided by God, he understands that his story was never just about him, but about a people who were being formed through successive pains, choices, and redemptions. At the end of his life, when Jacob crosses his hands to bless his grandchildren, when he speaks prophetic words over each son, when he asks to be buried next to his parents, we realize that the man who began clinging to a heel ends up holding promises with serene firmness, not because he became perfect, but because he learned to trust. And by blessing even Pharaoh, Jacob demonstrates something extraordinary. The awareness that God's presence in his life transformed him into a channel, no longer someone who needs to receive, but someone who can give. And so Jacob's story leaves us with a truth that doesn't shout, but remains, that God doesn't rush to transform us. He accompanies us, night after night, loss after loss, until what began as struggle transforms into communion. And perhaps, upon hearing this story, you realize that your own journey is not yet over, that there are still nighttime encounters, returns to old places, difficult losses, and unexpected blessings ahead. But you may also realize something even more important, that the God who walked with Jacob continues to walk, with the same patience, with those who are still learning to persevere. Jacob is no longer the same man who left home fleeing with a racing heart and empty hands, but he is also not yet someone who lives without pain, because spiritual maturity does not eliminate suffering, it only changes the way it is carried. And now, after the struggle in the Jabbok Valley and the reunion with Esau, Jacob continues limping, not only in body, but in memory, carrying marks that no longer bleed, but that are still felt in every decision, in every prolonged silence, in every night. When the past returns like an insistent whisper, reminding him that reconciliation does not erase history, it only ends the cycle of persecution that lasted a lifetime. When he settles in the land, builds altars, and gives names that acknowledge God's presence, something profoundly significant is happening, because Jacob is not only giving thanks for having survived, he is learning to recognize God not only in moments of extreme crisis, but also in the continuity of life, in the days when there is no escape, no physical struggle, only the silent responsibility of leading a large, complex household full of internal tensions. And it is precisely in this more common, less dramatic space that new pains arise, revealing that spiritual transformation is not a shield against tragedies, but a preparation to go through them with greater awareness. The violence suffered by Dinah and the brutal response of Simeon and Levi once again expose how untreated impulses can manifest destructively, and Jacob feels the weight of seeing in his sons reflections of conflicts he himself carried for years, perhaps realizing with anguish that blessings do not automatically erase patterns, and that what is not healed tends to repeat itself in other forms. And when he rebukes his sons, his reaction stems not only from fear of external consequences, but from the inner pain of someone who understands too late that spiritual leadership requires constant vigilance, not just declared faith. God's call to return to Bethel sounds like an invitation to remembrance and purification, because returning to the place of the first encounter is not going backward. It is going deeper. And when Jacob commands his household to abandon foreign gods, change their clothes and purify themselves, he is doing something that goes beyond a ritual. He is affirming that it is not possible to walk with God carrying symbols of old control. And this movement reveals a more conscious, less impulsive Jacob, someone who has learned that faith is not sustained only by past experiences, but by choices repeated over time. Rachel's death strikes Jacob in a silent and devastating way, because some losses don't allow for immediate processing, only a void that accompanies every step. By renaming his son, refusing to let pain define the future, Jacob demonstrates something that didn't exist in him at the beginning of the story: the ability to not allow suffering to have the final word. He shows that the transformation didn't make him immune to pain, but enabled him not to be governed by it, even when his heart is deeply wounded. As the years go by, the favoritism shown to Joseph reveals that even transformed men still carry frailties, because the Bible doesn't create idealized heroes, it creates real human beings. When Joseph is sold by his brothers, Jacob experiences a paralyzing grief, a pain that cannot be negotiated, manipulated, or avoided, only endured. Perhaps this is one of the most profound processes of his transformation, because now he doesn't fight, doesn't run away, doesn't deceive. He simply remains, weeping, waiting, living day after day with an absence that seems definitive, unaware that far from his eyes, God continues to work silently. When the news that Joseph is alive finally arrives, Jacob's heart needs to relearn how to believe, because after long years of loss, hope is also frightening. And upon descending to Egypt, confirmed by God, Jacob understands something essential, that his story was never just about individual mistakes and successes, but about the formation of a people, sustained by nighttime encounters, deep sorrows, and promises that survive time. And upon reuniting with his son, his tears are not only of joy, but of recognition that God was present even when all seemed lost. At the end of his life, as he blesses his children and grandchildren, as he crosses his hands once more, Jacob demonstrates that the one who began by trying to take the place of another now understands that blessings do not need to be stolen, only entrusted. And when he even blesses Pharaoh, it becomes clear that his transformation has made him a channel, not a hoarder, someone who has finally learned to stand before God without needing to control the outcome. And in dying, Jacob does not end a struggle. He rests, leaving as his legacy a silent truth that God does not give up on those who are still in the process. Jacob grows old in a foreign land, in Egypt, and this simple realization already carries a silent tension, because he lives surrounded by provision, honor, and security, but with his heart still tied to promises made in another land, on nights far more arid than those that now rest beneath his feet. This condition of being a pilgrim, even in comfort, reveals something profound about his matured spirituality, for Jacob understands that prosperity does not redefine identity, and that living well does not mean belonging completely to the place where one is, but remaining faithful to the story that God began long before any visible abundance. When he is brought before Pharaoh, he does not enter as someone intimidated, nor as someone who needs to prove his worth, but as a man aware of the weight of his own journey. When questioned about his years, Jacob does not respond with cold numbers or pride in recent achievements. He describes his life as a difficult pilgrimage, acknowledging that his days were few and bad compared to those of his fathers. This speech does not stem from bitterness, but from lucidity, because only those who have traveled long paths of pain and transformation can look back without romanticizing suffering or denying the faithfulness of God who sustained each step. The most surprising gesture of this encounter is not in the words, but in Jacob's act of blessing Pharaoh, because there a silent reversal of expectations takes place. The aged patriarch, a foreigner without a throne, without an army, extends his blessing to the most powerful ruler of his time, revealing that spiritual authority does not depend on social position, but on walking with God. And at that moment, it becomes clear that Jacob no longer lives trying to conquer space. He lives offering what he has received throughout a life marked by difficult encounters, profound losses, and fulfilled promises. The final years in Egypt become a time of stability that doesn't erase the memory of the struggles, but allows them to find meaning, and Jacob watches his children and grandchildren grow up, not without concern, not without awareness of the fragilities that still exist in that family, but with the certainty that God continues to work beyond what he can control. And perhaps that is why, as he approaches the end of his life, Jacob feels the urgency to transmit something that goes beyond material possessions, because he knows that visible inheritances are lost, but words full of discernment shape entire generations. In calling Joseph and his sons, Jacob revives an ancient pattern, crossing his hands, reversing expectations, blessing the youngest in a special way, and this gesture is not impulsive nor an unconscious repetition of the past, but an expression of someone who has learned to recognize that God is not bound by the human logic of primogeniture, strength, or appearance, and by adopting Ephraim and Manasseh as his own sons, Jacob expands the inheritance, not diminishing anyone, but opening space for the promise to continue unfolding in unexpected ways, as it always has from the beginning. The blessings pronounced upon each of his sons reveal a profoundly transformed man, because Jacob does not ignore flaws, does not soften sins, does not dispense empty words. He speaks honestly, acknowledging virtues and limitations, announcing consequences and futures. At that moment, it becomes clear that spiritual leadership is not about protecting children from the truth, but about preparing them to live with it, even when it hurts, even when it confronts them. Perhaps this is one of the greatest signs of maturity achieved by Jacob at the end of his journey. When Jacob gives clear instructions about his death and burial, insisting on being buried alongside his parents in the Promised Land, he reaffirms something essential, that his story did not begin in Egypt and does not end there. This request does not stem from nostalgia, but from faith, because he understands that God's promise continues beyond his own life, crossing generations, sustaining a people who will still face slavery, liberation, and new deserts. And in dying, Jacob leaves behind not only memories, but also direction, identity, and hope. The mourning that spreads across Egypt confirms the magnitude of his life, but Jacob's true legacy is not in the decreed time of weeping, but in the continuity of the promise he helped carry even when he did not fully understand the path. And perhaps that is what this chapter silently whispers, that God builds something greater than an individual biography, using imperfect stories to form an inheritance that spans generations, and that remaining faithful, even limping, can be the greatest gift one leaves for those who come after. Jacob is now living through a time when almost nothing extraordinary seems to be happening, and precisely for this reason, this period becomes one of the most challenging of his entire journey, because after significant encounters, nightly struggles, unexpected reconciliations, and profound losses, life settles into a more predictable rhythm, made up of similar days, continuous responsibilities, and decisions that no longer carry the dramatic weight of before, but which still shape the heart. It is in this seemingly ordinary space that God continues to work in a way that is as profound as it is invisible. For mature faith learns that silence is not absence, but a method. In Egypt, Jacob awakens without needing to flee, without needing to negotiate, without needing to fight for immediate survival. And this external rest exposes something internal, because when the danger ceases, what remains are the memories, the old questions, the pains that were not resolved by force. And perhaps that is why the biblical text shows us this period with fewer spectacular events, because now the transformation happens in a subterranean, slow, almost imperceptible way, like roots, growing in the dark, strengthening a tree that cannot forever depend on storms to stay alive. Jacob observes Joseph ruling wisely, sees his sons learning to live under a new reality, perceives how faithful God has been in ways he could never have foreseen, and this silent observation is in itself a healing process, because learning to trust after so many deceptions and losses doesn't happen all at once. It happens little by little, day after day, when the heart begins to accept that not everything needs to be controlled, that not every threat needs to be anticipated, and that God's presence doesn't depend on constant signs, but on continuous faithfulness. There is something profoundly human in this stage of spiritual life, because Jacob no longer needs to prove anything, no longer needs to earn blessings, no longer needs to assert himself before anyone, but needs to learn to rest without guilt, to live without expecting something bad to happen at any moment. And this is more difficult than it seems, because someone who has lived fleeing for so long learns to survive on alert, not in peace. And God's silence in this context is not punishment. It is re-education. It is the slow process of teaching someone to live without constant fear. The days accumulate, and Jacob revisits his story not with despair, but with growing discernment, realizing how each deception led him to an encounter, how each loss emptied him of false securities, how each weight forced him to stay when letting go seemed easier. And this inner reinterpretation doesn't happen in grand words. It happens in silent thoughts, in lingering glances at his grandchildren, in brief conversations at dusk, in moments when he realizes that the promise remains alive, not because he was strong, but because God was patient. It is in this silent time that Jacob fully becomes Israel, not because of a new external event, but because his identity finally stabilizes, ceasing to oscillate between fear and control. This stability is not the absence of fragility, it is an honest coexistence with it, because he knows that flaws still exist, pain still exists, consequences still exist, but he also knows that none of this alone defines the meaning of his story. This awareness is the fruit of a God who worked more in the pauses than in the confrontations, more in the intervals than in the direct shocks. When Jacob speaks to his sons, his words carry less urgency and more weight, less anxiety and more clarity. And this reveals that something profound has been established within him, because mature spiritual leadership doesn't shout, doesn't rush, doesn't react impulsively. It observes, discerns, and speaks at the right time. And perhaps this is one of the greatest miracles in Jacob's life, not the dream of the ladder, nor the struggle with the angel, but the ability to remain whole in ordinary days without needing something extraordinary to happen to feel that God is present. The silence of God in this chapter of history is not a narrative void. It is a space for formation, because there are areas of the human heart that are only shaped when nothing seems to be happening, when there is no crisis to push us forward, nor ecstasy to intoxicate us, only life as it is, repetitive, predictable, demanding. Jacob learns to live at this pace without losing faith, without abandoning hope, without returning to the old mechanisms of control. And this reveals that his transformation reached a deep layer, the one that sustains faith when there are no applause or visible miracles. Perhaps that is why this chapter is so necessary, because it speaks directly to those who live through long periods of silence, where God does not seem to speak clearly, where nothing changes drastically, where life goes on without major milestones, and yet demands perseverance, faithfulness, and trust. And the story of Jacob reminds us that God does not only act in decisive moments, he builds character in the intervals, in ordinary days, in seemingly tranquil years, silently preparing that which will still flourish in future generations. And so, as Jacob grows old under God's protection, without knowing exactly how his story will be remembered, something essential is established. The certainty that the same God who met him in his flight, who confronted him in his struggle, who sustained him in his loss, now remains with him in silence, showing that true faith is not measured only by the intensity of encounters, but by the ability to continue trusting when everything seems too quiet. And perhaps it is in this silence that many are also being worked on now, even without realizing it. There is a type of pain that doesn't arrive as an explosion, but as a permanence, a pain that doesn't tear all at once, but settles in, occupies space, shapes time, and slowly teaches what words could never convey. And it is precisely this type of pain that runs through Jacob's life in the years when he believes he has lost Joseph forever. Because unlike previous struggles, this one cannot be faced with force, nor with escape, nor with negotiation. It simply remains, demanding that he learn to live without answers, without immediate relief, and without the possibility of controlling the outcome. When his sons present the blood-stained tunic, Jacob recognizes the fabric, recognizes the colors, recognizes the symbolic weight of that gift he himself had given. And at that moment, something breaks deeply within him, because it is not only the loss of a son that strikes him, it is the painful confrontation with his own choices, with the favoritism he could not avoid, with the family patterns that repeated themselves despite everything he had lived through. And this awareness transforms the grief into something even heavier, because now he carries not only the absence, but the silent guilt of someone who wonders, night after night, if part of that tragedy could have been avoided. The following days bring no relief, only repetition, and Jacob dons mourning clothes as one who accepts that this pain will not be brief, refusing consolation, pushing away words that attempt to hasten a process that needs to be lived fully, because there are losses that cannot be overcome, only traversed, and this slow traversal works within him something that no previous victory could produce. A profound surrender, not to a specific situation, but to human limitation itself in the face of the mystery of life and the sovereignty of God. While Jacob weeps silently, something entirely different is being built far from his eyes, and this is one of the most difficult tensions of biblical faith, because the text allows us to know what Jacob does not know, that Joseph is alive, that God is using evil to bring about salvation, that the future is being prepared precisely through the pain that now seems futile. This discrepancy between human perception and divine action reveals a disconcerting truth, that God often works in layers that only align much later, when the heart has already been shaped by waiting. Years pass, and Jacob grows old with the pain, not getting used to it, but learning to live with it, and this silent coexistence dismantles the last vestiges of control that still existed within him, because now he doesn't plan, doesn't anticipate, doesn't manipulate. He just lives one day after another, sustained by a faith that is no longer nourished by signs, but by memory, by the remembrance of a God who already found him in the desert, who already confronted him in the night, who already sustained him in other losses, and this memory becomes the invisible thread that keeps him standing. When famine strikes the land and his sons go down to Egypt in search of food, Jacob doesn't imagine that the pain that has paralyzed him for so long is about to transform into movement. But even at that moment he resists, especially when the possibility of losing Benjamin arises, because losing another son of Rachel seems unbearable, almost as if God were asking too much. This resistance reveals that even a profoundly transformed man still needs to struggle with fear, no longer to conquer it by force, but to slowly surrender it to trust. The decision to let Benjamin go doesn't stem from sudden courage, but from exhaustion, from that point where holding on hurts more than letting go. By surrendering his son, Jacob also surrenders the last space where he still tried to control the future, entrusting it to a God who had already worked silently before, even when everything seemed lost. This act, though it may seem small, represents one of the greatest surrenders of his life, because now he is not only trusting in the midst of flight or struggle, but trusting in the midst of prolonged pain. When the news finally arrives that Joseph is alive, Jacob's heart doesn't immediately react with joy, because there are pains that make hope dangerous, almost cruel, and so he needs to see the chariots, hear the details, allow reality to slowly penetrate, until something within him revives, not as euphoria, but as a humble recognition that God was present even when he couldn't feel it. And this realization doesn't erase the years of suffering, but gives them meaning, transforming pain into preparation, mourning into maturity, waiting into a foundation for something greater. Upon descending to Egypt, Jacob understands that the pain that seemed pointless was, in fact, the path by which God prepared him for that moment, because without those years of mourning, he might not have learned to fully trust, to let go completely, to live without visible guarantees. And now, in embracing the son he thought was dead, he not only celebrates the reunion, he recognizes the faithfulness of a God who works in ways that the human heart only understands after a long time, when it has already been shaped by waiting. This chapter leaves us with a truth that is not comfortable, but is profoundly liberating, that some pains are not interruptions in God's plan, but silent instruments of preparation, working on patience, surrender, and inner depth. Perhaps whoever listens to this story today is also living through a similar time, carrying losses that still don't make sense, waiting for answers that haven't yet come, without realizing that, while the heart suffers, God is preparing something that can only be sustained by someone who has learned to trust, even when everything seemed lost. There are moments in Jacob's life when nothing external seems threatening, and yet something within him remains vigilant, as if his body had learned to rest, but his soul still carried the habit of waiting for the next blow. It is in this state of silent alert that he grows old, gradually understanding that remaining is not only about resisting amidst explicit pain, but about continuing faithful when the past no longer screams and the future has not yet fully revealed itself, because there are battles that are not resolved through confrontation, only through perseverance. Jacob has already wrestled with men. He has already wrestled with God. He has already endured irreparable losses and improbable reunions. But now he faces something more subtle: the need to continue living without turning each new day into a repetition of old fears. This requires a kind of courage that is rarely recognized, because remaining when everything is relatively stable can be more difficult than fighting when danger is evident, since silence leaves room for memories, regrets, and questions that don't find quick answers. Observing his sons grappling with their own responsibilities, choices, and conflicts, Jacob realizes that his influence is no longer manifested through direct intervention, but through the silent witness of someone who has learned to persevere, even limping, even without understanding everything. This realization confronts him with something profound, because for much of his life he believed he needed to constantly act to guarantee results, while now he learns that some things only flourish when given time, when God is allowed to guide processes beyond human control. The dawn, which once represented relief after nights of fear or struggle, comes to symbolize continuity, another day in which Jacob wakes up without fleeing, without hiding, without needing to prove anything. And this daily repetition slowly heals what no intense experience could immediately cure, because the soul learns to trust not only in great encounters with God, but in the silent faithfulness that sustains each breath, each meal, each seemingly ordinary conversation. Jacob understands, perhaps more clearly than ever, that remaining steadfast does not mean stagnation, but faithfulness to the process, because God does not work only in isolated events. He builds character in the succession of days that seem the same, and this slow construction requires patience, humility, and a willingness not to abandon the journey when the initial enthusiasm has passed, when miracles are no longer visible, when faith needs to be sustained without applause or immediate confirmations. There is something profoundly transformative in this final phase of the journey because Jacob no longer defines his identity by past mistakes or blessings received, but by the relationship built over time with a God who remained present in all seasons. This inner stability does not eliminate weaknesses, but prevents them from governing his decisions, revealing that spiritual maturity is not the absence of internal conflict, but the ability not to be dominated by it. When speaking to his grandchildren, Jacob doesn't just transmit stories, he transmits his attitude, the way he faces life, how he accepts limitations, how he recognizes God's action even when he doesn't understand all the details. This silent transmission is perhaps the most powerful aspect of his legacy, because children and grandchildren learn more from what they see repeatedly than from occasional speeches. And Jacob, by remaining faithful until the dawn of each new day, teaches that true faith doesn't run out when the journey becomes long. The final dawn of Jacob's life approaches without haste, and he does not face it with despair, but with the serenity of one who understands that his story does not end with him, because the promise he carried continues to live in his descendants, sustained by a God who works beyond human time. And this awareness transforms the waiting for the end into an act of trust, not resignation, because remaining until the final dawn is also a gesture of faith in the continuity of what God began. This chapter leads us to an essential understanding that perseverance is a profound spiritual act, especially when there is no evident drama, when faith needs to be sustained by constancy and not intensity. And perhaps that is precisely the challenge for many who hear this story, to learn to persevere in ordinary days, in quiet years, trusting that God continues to work even when nothing extraordinary seems to happen. Jacob teaches us, without lengthy speeches, that the greatest victory of faith is not winning visible battles, but continuing to walk with God when life becomes predictable, when the heart still bears scars, but is no longer governed by them. And thus, remaining until dawn repeatedly, he becomes not only a man who fought, but a man who trusted, teaching that silent faithfulness builds a legacy as powerful as any great confrontation. In the final years of his life, Jacob comes to understand something that took decades to develop within him: the realization that true blessings were never within human reach to be seized by force, manipulated, or secured through cunning. Because everything that truly sustained his life arrived when he no longer had his own resources, this mature awareness arises not from a sudden revelation, but from a long experience of loss, waiting, and new beginnings that slowly dismantled the illusion of control that had accompanied him since birth. When he recalls his youth, even silently, Jacob acknowledges that he spent much of his life trying to secure what he feared losing, acting as if the blessing could slip away at any moment, as if it were something too fragile to depend solely on divine promise. This mentality shaped his decisions, relationships, and conflicts, leading him down painful paths that only later revealed their formative purpose, for what was taken by force needed to be relearned as a gift, received with humility and sustained by trust. Prolonged time spent with Joseph, now ruler in Egypt, reinforces this understanding, because Jacob sees before him a son who did not seize power, but was led to him through suffering, faithfulness, and time. And this silent observation directly confronts his own history, revealing that God was always working in a deeper way than he could see, not only protecting the promise, but shaping people capable of carrying it without destroying it through fear or haste. When Jacob crosses his hands again to bless Joseph's sons, this gesture no longer carries tension or dispute, but serenity, because now he knows that the blessing does not need to follow human logic to be effective, and in doing so, He is not correcting the past or repeating an old mistake, but consciously affirming that God remains sovereign over the order of things, and that what he chooses does not need to be defended by human force to be fulfilled. The words Jacob addresses to his own sons reveal this profound change, for he does not make empty promises nor try to soften failures, but acknowledges limitations, points out consequences, and yet opens up the future, showing that true blessing does not ignore reality. It transcends it, and this stance reflects someone who has finally understood that blessing is not protecting from suffering, but preparing to face it with a firm identity and trust in God. In speaking of his death and the place where he wishes to be buried, Jacob demonstrates that his hope is not tied to present comfort or the power acquired by his family in Egypt, but to a promise that transcends generations. This desire is not motivated by nostalgia, but by spiritual conviction, because he knows that the blessing he received does not belong to a specific territory or a comfortable period of life. It belongs to the God who promised it, and who will continue to fulfill it far beyond his own existence. At this point in the story, it becomes clear that Jacob no longer fears losing what he has gained, because his identity is no longer tied to what he possesses or the place he occupies, but to the relationship he has built with God throughout a life marked by slow and profound transformation. This inner security allows him to release blessings without fear of scarcity, because whoever learns that a blessing cannot be stolen also learns that it does not run out when shared. Death approaches without desperate urgency, and Jacob does not face it as one who fears judgment or abandonment, but as one who trusts in the continuity of the promise, because his history has taught him that God does not abandon processes midway. And this final confidence does not arise from moral perfection, but from accumulated experience, from someone who erred, fell, struggled, fled, and yet was sustained by a faithfulness that did not depend on human performance. This chapter leads us to a truth essential to the entire narrative, that the blessing that truly transforms cannot be stolen, manipulated, or lost due to human failings, because it is sustained by God's faithfulness and not by the ability of the one who receives it. Perhaps this is one of the most profound healings offered by Jacob's story: liberation from the constant need to prove one's worth, secure one's place, or guarantee one's future through force. Jacob ends his journey as someone who has learned to rest in what he once tried to control, and this rest is not passivity, but mature trust, built over dark nights, irreversible losses, and unexpected reunions, showing that true blessing does not come without cost, but neither does it require anxious vigilance to be maintained, for what comes from God remains, even when man no longer has the strength to hold on to anything. Jacob's body bears signs that need no explanation, because the way he moves already tells a whole story. His slower pace, the careful support when he gets up, the silence that accompanies each gesture. These visible marks no longer seem strange to those who live with him, because everyone has learned that this man doesn't hurry, doesn't react immediately, doesn't chase after anything, as if time had ceased to be an enemy and had become a discreet companion, always present, shaping every detail of the life that now unfolds in a more restrained way. The tents are arranged around him, the sons take on roles, the grandchildren watch attentively, and Jacob remains in the center, not by imposition, but by natural inclination, because there is something in the way he listens that draws you in, something in the way he waits that calms. And when someone approaches bringing a problem, a doubt, or a concern, Jacob does not respond immediately, letting the weight of the question hang in the air for a few moments, as if he were teaching without words, that not everything needs to be resolved quickly to find meaning. Children carry their own stories, some still marked by tough decisions, others by awkward silences, and Jacob knows each one of them without needing to revisit them aloud, because he himself walked that path. And when he looks at each child, his eyes don't just fix on the present, but traverse time, recognizing their traces of impulsiveness, fear, a desire for recognition. All feelings that once inhabited his own heart, now resting in a different way, not erased, just accommodated in a more spacious area. When Jacob touches one of his son's shoulders, the gesture is firm yet careful, and this touch carries more than affection. It carries permanence, because hands that once clung together to avoid losing now rest securely, and the sons feel this, even without fully understanding, for there is something in the presence of someone who has endured so many difficult nights that makes the atmosphere more stable, as if the air around them becomes less heavy. The evening conversations stretch out unhurriedly. The sun slowly descends on the horizon, and Jacob remains seated, listening more than speaking, letting the stories unfold, letting mistakes be mentioned indirectly, letting worries repeat themselves, because he knows that repetition is also a way of processing. And this patience was not born from a calm temperament, but from a lifetime of being taught to wait, to endure, not to run away when something hurts or drags on. The grandchildren approach with curiosity, observing their grandfather in silence. They notice that he moves differently from other men, and although they don't know the details of his past, they sense that his body holds something important, something that cannot be learned in words. And when Jacob calls them closer, the simple act of crossing his hands over their heads creates a suspended moment where time seems to slow down. There is no rush to explain the meaning of that gesture, because the gesture itself already communicates continuity. The environment surrounding Jacob is not without tension, because large families carry intertwined histories, memories that don't always fit together easily. But something has changed in the way these conflicts circulate, because now there is an axis, a silent point of reference, and this point was not built by speeches, but by a life that has learned to remain when it would be easier to walk away, to endure when it would be simpler to harden. At night, when the camp falls silent, Jacob stays awake for a while longer, observing the sky he has observed so many times in different contexts. And now the brilliance of the stars awakens neither fear nor urgent expectation, only recognition, like someone who knows that something greater exists there that continues, independent of the pain already endured. And this calm gaze does not erase the difficult memories. It only places them in a place where they no longer dominate every thought. The children realize that Jacob doesn't shy away from sensitive issues, but he also doesn't force them. And this attitude creates a new space within the family, a space where the past can exist without being constantly reenacted. This change didn't happen by sudden decision, but through the accumulation of many nights in which Jacob learned to remain whole, even when something within him was still in process. The legacy that begins to take shape is not announced, not written, not proclaimed. It seeps into gestures, the rhythm of the home, the way decisions are made. And this kind of inheritance doesn't immediately attract attention, but it sustains entire generations without needing to be remembered aloud, because it manifests itself whenever someone chooses to wait instead of reacting, to listen instead of dominating, to remain instead of fleeing. Jacob, now aged, doesn't view this legacy as someone calculating results. He simply continues living in the only way he has learned after so much time, present, attentive, open to what may yet be revealed. And as time goes on, it becomes clear that the man who began the story, clinging to another's heel, now sustains his family, not with force, but with presence, offering something that can only be transmitted by someone who has overcome their own fragility without letting it turn into bitterness. Jacob wakes up early, as he had done for most of his life, not out of anxiety, but out of habit forged on long roads, cold nights, and responsibilities that never allowed for complete rest. As he sits at the entrance of the tent, observing the slow movement of the camp, he realizes something he wouldn't have noticed years before, that God never expected him to be ready to walk beside him, because the journey always happened while he was still learning to take each step. The days now follow a calmer rhythm, but not an empty one. For each encounter, each conversation, each decision carries the weight of a story traversed by errors, losses, and successive reconstructions. And Jacob recognizes that he never offered God an idealized version of himself, only what he had at each stage. An insecure heart at the beginning, restless hands in youth, a wounded body in maturity, and now a more complete presence, still marked, still limited, but available. Observing his sons grappling with issues he himself faced in the past, Jacob no longer feels the urgency to intervene as before, because he has learned that walking together doesn't require guiding every step. This change manifests itself simply in respectful silence, in attentive observation, in a willingness to remain close even when there is no immediate solution, revealing that God has always been with him in the same way, close, constant, without demanding perfection to remain present. There are moments when Jacob recalls his own history, not as someone revisiting a mistake, but as someone traveling a familiar path, recognizing the points where he stumbled, the places where he lingered too long, the nights when he thought he was alone. And in these memories, he realizes that the divine presence manifested itself not only in moments of clear revelation, but also in the confusing intervals when nothing seemed to make sense, and yet the journey continued. When Jacob moves through the camp, leaning on something almost imperceptibly, the younger men make way for him without realizing they are doing so out of natural respect, not as an order, and this detail reveals something profound, because authority built through coexistence doesn't need to be asserted. It establishes itself over time, just as Jacob's relationship with God was solidified not by grand declarations, but by a succession of steps taken even when the path wasn't entirely clear. In the afternoon, when the heat subsides and the air becomes lighter, Jacob allows himself to observe the horizon for long minutes. And in this simple gesture lies an entire story condensed. For the same man who once looked into the distance calculating escape routes now observes without haste, allowing time to pass, and this tranquil gaze does not indicate an absence of memory, but reconciliation with it. A state that is only achieved when one accepts that walking with God includes failings, without interrupting his presence. The conversations with Joseph take place in a low tone, filled with silent complicity, and Jacob perceives in his son something he recognizes in himself. Not a painless journey, but a faithfulness built in adverse environments. Hearing accounts of the administration, the difficult decisions, and the inevitable consequences, Jacob doesn't offer lengthy advice. He simply listens, because he knows that walking with God doesn't eliminate complexity. It only provides support to navigate it without getting completely lost. At night, when the stars reappear, Jacob recalls other skies, other nights, other silences, and realizes that at none of these stages did God demand that he become someone different before continuing his journey, only that he remain available. This realization doesn't come as immediate emotional relief, but as profound stability, the feeling that imperfection was never an obstacle to the divine presence, only part of the process by which that presence became more recognizable. The grandchildren approach again, curious, bringing simple questions, stories of the day, small disputes, and Jacob responds with full attention, because he understands that God has also manifested himself in this way in his life, through seemingly ordinary events that, seen from afar, have proven decisive. and this perception transforms each interaction into something worthy of care, not out of fear of making mistakes, but out of awareness that the journey is built in everyday life. Time moves on without solemn announcements, and Jacob feels his body respond differently to the mornings, to short walks, to moments of rest. But there is no unease in this recognition, only acceptance, because he knows that God continues to walk beside him even when the pace slows, and this silent companionship has become more evident now than in the days when everything seemed urgent. The faith that sustains Jacob at this point in the story doesn't depend on explanations. It manifests itself in the way he gets up, waits, listens, and blesses. This faith didn't arise from a single encounter, but from the sum of many steps taken with hesitation, fear, and doubt, yet taken nonetheless, showing that walking with God was always less about arriving at a specific place and more about not abandoning the path. This chapter reveals something that runs throughout Jacob's story, the understanding that God never abandoned him when he was incomplete, tired, or confused, but remained close, accompanying him at every stage with constant patience. Perhaps this perception becomes clearer now, as life slows down, as the great conflicts are behind them, revealing that the God who walks with the imperfect does not tire of the journey, because he himself sustains each step. Time passes differently when Jacob realizes he no longer needs to prove anything, because the promise that once seemed too fragile to be entrusted solely to God's word now stands on its own, enduring years, losses, and changes of scenery without dissolving. This realization doesn't come as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual recognition born from the silent observation of everything that continued to exist, even when he lacked the strength to sustain anything with his own hands. Jacob often sits in silence, letting the sounds of the camp fill the space around him, the distant laughter of children, the bleating of flocks, the organized movement of men. And in these moments he realizes that the promise is not manifested only in grand events, but in the continuity of life, in the repetition that does not exhaust, in the presence that does not impose itself, because that which survives time does not need to constantly assert itself, only to remain. The names of his sons echo in his memory, like milestones on a long journey, each carrying its own story, marked by mistakes, successes, and consequences that unfolded over the years. Jacob recognizes that the promise did not advance despite these stories, but through them, using winding paths, imperfect decisions, and belated reconciliations to forge something greater than any initial expectation. This realization brings a profound quietude, for he no longer needs to reorganize the past for the present to make sense. When Jacob observes Joseph acting wisely before the Egyptians, he realizes that the promise has adapted to a completely different environment from the one where it was first announced, showing that it was not confined to a specific territory or a single form of expression. This shift reveals something essential, because what comes from God is not lost when the setting changes. It simply finds new ways to manifest itself, sustained by a faithfulness that does not depend on a favorable context. There are times when Jacob feels the weight of the years more intensely, in the weariness that comes earlier, in the body that demands longer breaks. And yet, even within these limitations, the promise does not seem diminished, only quieter, as if it had learned to exist without demanding constant attention. And this maturity of the promise reflects Jacob's own maturity, who can now live with limitations without interpreting them as a threat to the future. The nights grow longer, and Jacob stays awake on some of them, not out of restlessness, but out of ancient habit. And as he looks at the sky, he remembers other nights marked by fear, flight, and struggle, realizing that the same sky was present in all of them, indifferent to human changes, and this constancy reinforces something he has learned over time. that the promise was never conditioned by his emotional state, but by the faithfulness of the one who made it. The grandchildren grow up before his eyes, learning to walk, to talk, to find their place within the community. And Jacob observes this growth with quiet attention, knowing that many of them will not experience the same pain he faced, and this difference does not bother him, for he understands that the promise does not require a repetition of suffering to remain alive, only a continuity of relationship. And this understanding transforms the inheritance into something light, not as a burden, but as a direction. In discreet conversations with Joseph, Jacob realizes that the future unfolds beyond his own life, with challenges he will not personally face, and yet he does not feel the need to control this unfolding, because he has learned that the promise does not need constant supervision to be fulfilled, only trust to be transmitted, and this detachment reveals how much his relationship with God has matured, moving from the fear of losing to the serenity of trusting. When Jacob speaks of his parents and grandparents, his words carry no idealization, but recognition, for he knows that the promise has traversed imperfect generations before him, sustained not by the moral strength of men, but by divine persistence, and by situating his own story within this continuity, Jacob finds rest, for he understands that he is not the center of the plan, only a part of it, and this perception brings freedom, not insignificance. Time moves forward without announcing dramatic ruptures, and Jacob feels that the promise continues to pulsate discreetly, present in daily decisions, in relationships, in the way the family organizes itself and moves. And this silent presence confirms something essential, that what survives time does not depend on constant intensity, but on deep rooting, built over years of imperfect but persistent faithfulness. This chapter does not end with a climax, because the promise does not need a triumphant ending to prove its strength. It reveals itself precisely in its ability to traverse time without wearing out. And Jacob, now aware of this, rests in the certainty that what began before him will continue afterward, sustained by a God who is not in a hurry, does not abandon, and does not tire of accompanying human stories throughout the generations. Jacob feels the weight of his own body differently now, not as an urgent discomfort, but as a constant presence. Each breath a little slower, each movement demanding attention, and yet there is something profoundly stable in his posture, as if physical exertion has given way to an inner stillness that no longer depends on favorable circumstances, because the man who once spent nights fighting not to lose now remains awake simply to be attentive to what still moves around him, without the need to react. The tents rest in silence during the deepest hours of the night. The camp breathes together, and Jacob observes this scene as one who recognizes a rhythm that no longer needs to be directed, for life flows without his constant intervention. And this recognition does not generate emptiness, but rest, because he understands that there is a time when leading is necessary, and another when allowing things to unfold reveals a deeper trust than any direct action. When Jacob closes his eyes for a few moments, images emerge effortlessly. The heel held at birth, Esau's tense face, the smell of the stew, his father's trembling hand, the hard desert floor, the ladder reaching for the sky, the weight of the night on the Jabbok, the sudden pain in his hip, his brother's unexpected embrace, the weeping for Joseph, the reunion that seemed impossible, and all these scenes pass without provoking the same impact as before, for now they occupy an integrated place. Not as open wounds, but as parts of a path that has found meaning in the whole. The silence that envelops Jacob is not empty. It is populated by presence, a presence that does not announce itself with words, nor does it demand specific gestures. It simply remains. And this kind of presence is recognized not by external signs, but by the absence of inner urgency, by the tranquility that does not depend on immediate answers, by the ability to remain whole even when the body no longer keeps up with the rhythm of before. When someone approaches, Jacob slowly opens his eyes, listens attentively, responds only when necessary, and this way of being creates a rare space where the conversation slows down, where the other person feels they can also remain, without needing to justify or defend themselves, and this space becomes one of the clearest signs that something has profoundly changed, because the struggle that once occupied every gesture has now given way to a peaceful coexistence with what is. The children realize that Jacob no longer carries the restlessness that once shaped his decisions, and although tensions, unresolved issues, and paths each one needs to tread alone still exist, there is a shared feeling that the family's core is firm, not through control, but through coherence, and this quiet firmness sustains more than any word of authority could. As time goes on, Jacob allows himself to rest more often, not as one who gives up, but as one who trusts, and this rest reveals a communion that does not depend on specific rituals, for it manifests itself in the way he accepts limits, how he receives help, how he allows others to assume responsibilities that he previously concentrated on himself. And this openness does not arise from fragility alone, but from an inner certainty built up over a lifetime. There are times when Jacob stands alone, gazing at the sky, and in those moments there are no urgent requests, nor intense questioning, only silent recognition, like someone who knows he no longer needs to fight to be seen, because the presence that has accompanied him from the beginning never demanded performance, only permanence. And this awareness becomes true communion, one that does not depend on constant effort to be maintained. When Jacob calls his sons closer, his gestures are slow, intentional, and each touch carries more history than explanation. For hands that once clung together in fear now rest in confidence. And the sons feel this without it needing to be said, recognizing in that contact something that cannot be learned in words, only in prolonged coexistence with someone who has gone through their own struggle without becoming a prisoner of it. Jacob's body begins to respond to time in a definitive way, and he perceives this without alarm, because the communion that has formed over the years does not dissolve with physical weakening. On the contrary, it becomes more visible, simpler, more essential, sustained not by extraordinary feats, but by a relationship built step by step, night after night, choice after choice. As the final moment approaches, there is no hurry or pretense, only continuity, as if the same presence that accompanied him in flight, in struggle, in loss, and in waiting now remained there, silent, firm, sufficient. And Jacob surrenders to this rest with the serenity of one who recognizes that communion did not begin there and does not end there, for it spans the entire life and continues beyond it. Jacob's story ends quietly, without the need for a final explanation, because what began as a struggle found its conclusion in communion, not as an isolated point, but as the natural result of a long, imperfect, and sustained journey. And perhaps that is the image that remains, that of a man who did not win by force or cunning, but by remaining available throughout the entire journey, allowing God's presence to transform each stage into a living relationship. And so, when silence settles in definitively, it does not represent absence, but fullness, for the communion that has formed no longer depends on words, gestures, or nights of struggle. It simply is, sustaining that which remains beyond the narrated story, echoing as a silent invitation to all those who still walk, still fight, still wait, showing that remaining may be the deepest path to finding rest.